Our task here was to choose a work of art that was previously unknown to you and to begin with the elements of art and principles of design, noting its most prominent visual characteristics, and then you were to take that information and go on to try to make some sort of determination about style. Finally, if you noted any compositional strategies, those were to be noted in your essay as well. Okay, this painting right here is of course Botticelli's lovely Primavera, painted at the very dawn of the Renaissance. Now what is the Renaissance? The Renaissance was a word that means rebirth, not birth, but rebirth. So during this period, artists and scholars were preoccupied with the works that had been produced in antiquity. In fact, there was some archaeology going on, some works of art, some sculptures were newly being unearthed in Rome. They'd been covered for 1,000 years, and this provided a great deal of inspiration for the artists of that day. So coming out of the medieval period where works of art had been essentially flat, there was more of a preoccupation with storytelling and not so much in naturalism and optical correctness. Artists, after seeing the works of antiquity, really began to focus on the human figure, to make these figures move in space instead of standing there stiff, and they developed linear perspective to a very high degree, basing it in mathematics. So let's take a look now at some of the qualities that characterize this work of art. Okay, some of you have noted space, so let's talk about the space element here. Take a look at these figures right here. They're sort of placed on the same ground line. Their feet are, if you drew an imaginary line right across here, their feet would all kind of be in the same place. But our main figure, Venus, she is perceived to be further back in space simply because she's higher up on the canvas. So this is a technique that's sort of placing the figures higher up. This technique had been used going back to the archaic period for painted Greek pottery. This is a very time-tested way of making figures look as if they're occupying space. Now take a look, we also have beyond our main figure, we have this row of trees here. Now these trees, although some are in various sizes, some are thinner than others, it's not clear to us whether these are smaller trees or whether these smaller ones are back in space. So basically, we're looking at essentially a shallow space, even though this is an orange grove and in theory it should be rather deep. The way it's expressed here visually is pretty shallow. We're only looking at, I'm going to just throw out a number here, maybe 10 or 15 feet between our foreground and where the trees start, where they're planted in the ground here, right along this line. Okay, so we've noted that our space, although rooted in naturalism, there is an attempt to create the illusion of three-dimensional space. It's still essentially shallow. Okay. Now, the line element was something that many of you mentioned was very prominent. So let's take a look at the line element here. Okay, so line can take a number of forms. Line can be an individual outline standing on its own, or line can be an edge. Take a look at this edge right here, where this white garment meets the black background. What we have here is an edge here that forms this very sharp line. Okay, so let's think about these sharp edges for a moment. Basically, we see that everywhere. If we look anywhere between the figure and the background, we're going to see something that's very distinct. We're not seeing figures that are sort of blending and emerging with the background. These figures are almost pasted on top. They're very, very separate with these definite lines, these definite edges that separate the two. So this clarity is something that is typical of Botticelli, but not typical of later Renaissance paintings, where there was more of an attempt to really replicate the way the eye actually sees. So suppose that we walked upon an orange grove and saw a group of figures like this. Our eyes would not focus on everybody all at once. We wouldn't see everybody in sharp focus just like this. Our eyes would move around, and we might see our main character in focus while everyone else at the periphery is out of focus. Then our eyes would move to another figure and the same thing would happen. So more modern painters they realized that, and they began to paint in sort of an unfinished manner in the areas around the edges where our eyes were not meant to focus, and they kept the main figures in focus. But that's not what's happening here. Botticelli has pretty much everybody depicted to the same degree of detail and focus, clarity, where all of these lines meet. Okay, now line also takes the form of these garments, and these garments are moving in space to denote these figures that are twirling around and moving forward and flying through the air and so on. So let's take a look at Zephyr. He's our god of the west wind here. Take a look at this, these lines that are formed in his cloak as it's sort of blowing through the air. His lover Florence is sort of coming down for a landing here, and these garments, these diaphanous transparent garments, are forming these sort of outlines that wrap around her body and really show us the contours of her body. Now this is a little strange. Florence has some growth coming out of her mouth, and that seems a little odd to us, but that's part of this mythology. Florence transforms into Flora. Take a look at Flora. Flora is our stunningly beautiful goddess. She's wearing this robe made of probably silk with these beautiful embroidered flowers. And right here in the fold of her dress, she has this great big crop of roses that she's spreading out on the ground here. So our title here is Spring. She's spreading out these flowers, populating the land, making it lovely and springing to life. Okay, we've talked about the line element, we've talked about the space element. Okay, let's just move on here to style. Several of you, Michael, Jacqueline, you've noted that this is naturalistic in style. Okay, now let's go back to our original list here. So if we think of this as a continuum with abstract first, naturalism right in the middle, and then idealism on the other end of that spectrum, naturalism is right in the center. So basically anything that looks as it should, that is optically correct, correctly proportioned, responding to light and shadow the way we would expect it to, that would be considered naturalism. Naturalism is a very general term. Now take that naturalism and polish it, perfect it, make the humans, as we see here, they're tall. They're a little taller than regular humans. Their heads are a little smaller in proportion. They're tall, they're attenuated. They have these beautiful, absolutely gorgeous faces, this lovely translucent skin. They're wearing these beautiful garments that are wrapping around their body, showing these lovely curves. These figures are highly idealized. So Jasmine and Ariana, you noted this idealized style, and that's exactly correct. So although this is rooted in naturalism, the sense of optical correctness, this is definitely an example of the idealized style. Okay, so going back for a moment about these figures, we have Flora. She's casting these flowers onto the ground. We have these figures right here. These are the three graces. They represent time, and they're showing up at the springtime, at the perfect time for all of this vegetation springing out of the ground here. And look at these orange blossoms and these oranges. They're right at the dawn, beginning to fruit and come into where they're ripe and ready to eat. Our figure right here, our main figure, she's Venus. She's, of course, the goddess of love and fertility and all of those type of things. So what's happening here is she's shown up at this particular moment. She's ready to put into process all of these forces that are contributing to the fertility of the land. Okay, so I've just described a collection of goddesses, and there is a couple gods here. This is Mercury and this is Zephyr over here. So these gods and goddesses are occupying what looks to be a sacred grove. This is not a real place that you would see in, say, Florida. This is definitely contrived and posed and arranged the way the artist is trying to deliver a particular message. He's not trying to depict an actual space that he sees. He's trying to depict something of an idealized world. Okay, so the fact that we're dealing with gods and goddesses, that should probably be your first clue that we're not quite dealing with naturalism. After all, we don't have gods and goddesses roaming around our natural world, at least not that we can see. So And your second clue should be simply the loveliness with which everything is described. There's nothing but grace and beauty here, which brings us back to our subject matter. Now, some of you have taken a shot at subject matter, but for the most part, most of you concluded that this was a gathering or a celebration of some sort, and that's really what we're looking for here. It would be impossible for us 21st century viewers to look at this painting that's some 500 years old and to truly understand its meaning. We come to any work of art, particularly ones that old, with our own set of prejudices and ideas, and whatever we think might not be the case at all. So, for example, all of these figures look pregnant to us. That's not exactly what's going on, although this swelling belly does indicate something of this femininity and this fertility. Okay, so there's one more layer of meaning here. Take a look at Venus, our main character. We know she's our main character for a number of reasons. We already noted right at the beginning how she's set off from the ground line of all these other figures that are right up here. The motion is all kind of swirling around her. She might even be directing it with her hand in this sort of pose of benediction. She's right in the center, not exactly dead center, but pretty close. So if we drew a line down the center of this canvas, we have a definite visual equilibrium. We have figures on the right who are equivalent in visual weight to the figures on the left. We have this Cupid here. He sort of anchors her at the top again, sort of, although he's pointing off in the other direction, our eye sort of remains along this axis here. But I'd like you to note this in particular. We've already mentioned how this orange grove doesn't look quite natural. We're not sure if these trees denote distance or if they're all in one sort of a row. Now take a look at this arch here. This is deliberate. This arch is not any sort of natural arch that we would probably see. It's very defined. This arch is a very obvious reference to perhaps a halo, perhaps an apse in a church, perhaps an architectural niche. So there are many interpretations of this work of art. No one can say for sure, although some of these figures we can identify from mythology with a high degree of confidence, but this particular collection of them, assembled in this particular way, in this particular activity, can't be attributed to any one source, although several people have their theories. But in any case, this church-like setting here, this apse-like architectural setting, does seem fairly obvious. It's the fairly obvious vocabulary of a Christian Madonna that one would see during the Renaissance. So the artist is making some sort of a visual connection between the Virgin Mary and Venus, the goddess of love. Okay, so everyone, I think you've done a very nice job here. Now, if you were a little short on your elements and principles, please try to correct that. That's really our foundation here. That's basically the most important thing we're doing in this course. So stay focused on those elements and principles. Use them to give you some sort of indication about style. We've mentioned that this was rooted in naturalism, but it's a very idealized style. So that should give you a broader perspective on the style from this period. Finally, if you noticed any compositional strategies, please note that as well. I didn't see that in any of these essays unless I accidentally missed it, other than balance, axial balance. So thanks a lot, everyone, and keep up the lovely work.